The glare from the overhead light on my kitchen table was blinding. Rick slid another paper in front of me. "Just sign here, William," he said, his voice slick with false patience. "It's a standard disbursement form for the last $50,000. Then we're all done." The pen felt heavy and alien in my hand. His accomplice, the man he called his financial advisor, watched me with the eyes of a hawk. Rick let out a low, cruel chuckle. "What are you going to do? Call the cops? They'll see a confused old man who signed a perfectly legal contract. It's over." The finality in his voice was a slamming door in a cold, empty house. The wind rattled the window pane, a lonely, percussive sound. He truly believed he had won, that I was just a ghost in my own home, waiting to be exorcised. The advisor, a smirking man named Davis, tapped a highlighted line on the loan document. It showed a principal balance of $400,000 drawn against my home's equity. My signature was on every page, a clumsy, wavering scrawl that looked both like and unlike my own. They had me cornered, surrounded by a fortress of paperwork they had built around my life. I simply folded my hands on the table. The old oak felt cool and solid beneath my palms, an anchor in the swirling chaos. I looked up, met Rick's triumphant gaze, and allowed a small, tight smile to touch my lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth, but of cold, hard certainty. The air in the room shifted, growing heavy with unspoken things. Rick's smirk faltered, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He saw something he couldn't process. "What?" he demanded, his voice suddenly sharp and uncertain. "What's so funny?" I just kept smiling as the silence stretched thin, ready to snap. He thought this was the end. But 3 months earlier, it all began with a simple letter and a betrayal I never could have imagined. It had been a quiet Tuesday. The small brick house felt large and empty, as it always did since Betty passed. Every wooden surface still gleamed with lemon polish, her scent a comforting ghost in the silent rooms. I was sorting the mail at the very same kitchen table, the morning sun warm on my hands when I saw it, a crisp, formal envelope from a company called Liberty Equity Partners. The name meant nothing to me. I slid it open with my thumb. It was a disbursement notice. A payment of $15,000, it said, had been made from a reverse mortgage account in my name, account number ending in 8842. My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. It had to be a mistake. My house was paid off decades ago. Betty and I burned the mortgage papers in a little ceremony in the backyard. My caretaker, Rick, bustled in then, setting my groceries on the counter with his usual cheerful energy. "Everything okay, William? You look like you've seen a ghost." Rick, the son of an old friend from the union, had been a godsend these last 2 years. He handled my bills, my shopping, my appointments. He was family. I trusted him completely. My hand trembled as I held out the letter. He took it, his brow furrowing with practiced concern. "Liberty Equity? Oh, that's just a scam, William. They prey on seniors, sending fake documents to scare them. It's disgusting. Don't you worry about it." He folded the letter decisively and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "I'll shred it for you." Later that afternoon, I was clearing out the hall closet to make room for a new shelf. I pulled out a heavy wooden box containing my father's old screwdrivers. Each one had a handle of smooth, worn oak or dark rosewood, the steel tips still perfectly machined. Rick walked by and glanced in. "What's all that old junk?" he asked. "Just some tools," I replied. He scoffed. "You should toss 'em. They're worthless." I put the box away, a strange ache in my chest. Those tools had helped me build this life. I remembered just last year when Rick had patiently helped me rewire a stubborn floor lamp. His younger, steadier hands a welcome help. He'd held the flashlight without complaint for nearly an hour. How could that same man stand there and lie to my face about a letter that had frozen the blood in my veins? A week later, a second letter came. This one I intercepted before Rick arrived. It was a full account statement. The reverse mortgage was for $400,000. 3 payments totaling $65,000 had already been dispersed to a Wells Fargo account I didn't recognize. The air in my quiet, sunlit kitchen suddenly turned frigid. This was not a scam. This was a theft happening in slow motion. My hands shaking, I dialed the number on the statement. A man with a voice as smooth as oiled machinery informed me the loan was perfectly valid. It was signed and notarized on March 12th, Mr. Davis. He said cheerfully. We also have the certificate from your mandatory FHA-approved counseling session, all in good order. I had never been to a counseling session in my life. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Rick, a month ago, with a stack of papers. Just some updates for your property tax assessment, William, he'd said breezily. My arthritis was flaring up that day, and I could barely hold a pen. He had placed his hand over mine, helping me guide my signature across a dozen dotted lines. Don't worry about the fine print, he'd soothed. It's all standard. I drove to my bank, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The branch manager, a kind woman who knew me by name, listened with a pained expression. I'm so sorry, William, but the transfers were authorized from a joint account opened with your credentials. Legally, our hands are tied. This is a matter for the police, for a lawyer. A lawyer. The word alone sounded expensive. Another mountain I had no strength to climb. Rick must have had a tracker on my car or my phone. He was waiting for me in the bank's glass-walled lobby. Trying to make a scene, William, he murmured, his voice a venomous whisper in my ear. He took my arm, his grip like a vice. You're just getting confused in your old age. Let's go home. He smiled apologetically at the watching teller as he led me, the docile, senile old man, out the door. I found a pro bono lawyer through a senior center. Sarah was young, overworked, but her eyes were sharp. Classic elder fraud, she sighed, scanning the statement. They isolate, build trust, and then drain the assets. Our only real shot is proving that FHA counseling certificate is a forgery. Without it, the entire loan contract is void. For the first time in weeks, a fragile shard of hope lodged itself in my chest. The shard shattered 2 weeks later. Sarah called, her voice heavy with defeat. I'm so sorry, William. I subpoenaed the records from the counseling agency. They're a legitimate licensed firm. The certificate was signed by a counselor named Arthur Davis. He even submitted a sworn affidavit stating you attended the required 90-minute session on March 10th, in person. It's his word and his license against yours. The next blow came by registered mail. It was a notice of accelerated disbursement. The document stated that due to market volatility, the remaining loan balance of $335,000 was scheduled to be transferred in a final lump sum in exactly 10 business days. Rick was done siphoning. He was grabbing the rest and running. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. Sleep was impossible. I was a prisoner in my own home, a ghost at the feast. Just after midnight, I heard Rick's muffled voice from the guest room. I crept closer. He was on the phone, his tone giddy and triumphant. Yeah, the whole nut. About a week. Then I'm on a plane to Belize. No extradition, my friend. Perfect. A pause. The old fool? He was never going to use that equity. I just put it in circulation. Putting it in circulation. The phrase echoed in my head. He spoke of my life's work, the home Betty and I had poured our souls into, as if it were a clogged drain he was clearing. I retreated to the living room and sank into my armchair. The faint, clean scent of lemon polish rose from the end table. She had loved this house. He was stealing our memories, our sanctuary. The next morning, Rick rushed out for an appointment, leaving his laptop open on the coffee table. An email was displayed on the screen, a flight confirmation. One way, business class, to Belize City, departing in 9 days. But my blood ran cold when I saw the passenger name. It wasn't Rick. The ticket was for Arthur Davis. Rick and the counselor were just partners. They were the same man. Feeling the walls of his trap closing in, I found myself in the hall, pulling the heavy box from the closet shelf. I didn't know why. I just needed to hold something real. I took out my father's old Phillips head screwdriver, its rosewood handle worn smooth as ripperstone. For 60 years, these tools had fixed everything from radios to wiring. But they couldn't fix this. They were just useless relics, the symbol of my own powerlessness. I stared at the dark wood, the tarnished brass collar where the steel met the handle. And then I saw them. Faintly burned into the base of the handle were my father's initials, TD. A cold, sharp memory pierced the fog of my despair. Rick, a few weeks ago, making small talk in the kitchen. What was your dad's first name again, William? Thomas, right? I'd nodded. Yes, Thomas Davis. Thomas Davis. Arthur Davis. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated, vicious insult. Rick hadn't just invented a fake counselor. He had stolen my father's name, my own family history, and was using it as the alias for his crime. The sheer, personal malice of it was breathtaking. He had woven my past into the weapon he was using to destroy my future. I had to find the connection, the proof. I set the screwdriver down, my mind racing. An alias, a fake identity. He would have needed documentation for that. A driver's license, a social security card, something to open the bank accounts and get that counseling license. You couldn't just invent a person out of thin air. Not one solid enough to defraud a federal mortgage program. Somewhere, there had to be a paper trail. The memory of him helping me with the lamp returned, sharp and clear. Not the patience, but the details. He'd been fascinated by the old wiring, asking questions about the house's original construction. He'd asked to see the fuse box in the basement, claiming he was worried about a surge. At the time, I'd seen it as due diligence, a sign of his care. Now I saw it as reconnaissance. I went down to the damp, cool basement. The air smelled of concrete and earth, a scent that hadn't changed in 50 years. The old fuse box was still there, a heavy metal door set into the cinder block wall. Next to it was a newer breaker panel I'd installed in the 90s. Rick had spent 10 minutes down here, supposedly checking the circuits. What was he really looking for? Behind a stack of old paint cans, tucked away on a dusty shelf, was Betty's small gardening chest. She kept her seed packets and hand trowels in it. It was exactly the kind of forgotten, sentimental object a thief would ignore. Rick had probably walked past it a dozen times. I pried open the rusted latch. Inside, beneath a pile of dried lavender, was a bundle of old documents tied with twine. My birth certificate, Betty's, our marriage license, and underneath them all, a brittle, folded paper. My father's death certificate, dated 1908. It listed his full name, Thomas Elias Davis, his date of birth, his social security number. All the raw data needed to build a ghost. Rick hadn't just used the name. He had stolen the identity of a dead man. My father. The betrayal was a physical shock, leaving me breathless. He hadn't just defrauded me. He had desecrated a memory. I remembered him asking, "You don't have any family left, do you, William? No siblings, no cousins." I told him no, that I was the last of my line. To him, that wasn't a sad fact. It was an opportunity. My father was a ghost no one else could speak for, but a ghost leaves traces. The FHA counseling license. It had to be registered with the state. An identity thief might get a fake driver's license, but a professional certification involved a much deeper level of vetting. This was Rick's weak point. His arrogance had made him reach too far, creating a fraudulent credential that had to exist in a government database. A database I could now access with the right information. My mind returned to the screwdriver in my pocket, the initials TD burned into the wood. It was my father's signature. A thought sparked a wild, improbable connection. My father wasn't just an electrician. Before the war, he had worked as a clerk for a notary public. He was meticulous, obsessed with details, with the integrity of a signature. He had a peculiar habit, one he'd taught me. Never trust a single lock, he used to say. Always have a second, hidden one. He applied it to everything. On his old roll-top desk, there was a secret compartment. In the tool shed, a loose floorboard. His obsession with hidden security was a family joke. I suddenly felt a surge of adrenaline. What if he'd applied that logic to his own tools? I rushed back upstairs, my heart hammering. I laid all 7 screwdrivers from the box on the kitchen table, lining them up like soldiers for inspection. They looked identical to how I'd always remembered them. Simple, well-used tools. But I was seeing them now with new eyes, with my father's paranoid, meticulous gaze. I started with the largest flathead, twisting the handle, trying to unscrew the brass collar. Nothing. I tried the next, and the next, all solid. I was about to give up, to dismiss it as the fantasy of a desperate old man, when I picked up the smallest Phillips head. Its rosewood handle was darker than the others, almost black. As I gripped it, my thumb pressed into the worn wood. I felt a tiny click, a minuscule shift, as if a spring had been released. Holding my breath, I twisted the handle's base. It turned smoothly, silently, unscrewing from the brass collar. It wasn't solid wood. It was a hollow cylinder, a perfectly crafted little hideaway. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded cotton, was a tiny, tightly rolled cylinder of microfilm. It was no bigger than the tip of my little finger. I didn't have a microfilm reader, but the town library did. I felt like a spy in a cheap thriller, my father's screwdriver heavy in my coat pocket. I sat in a dusty carrel in the library's basement, the machine humming before me. I carefully fed the tiny roll into the feeder. The screen flickered to life, displaying a grainy black and white image of a document. It was a ledger page. My father's elegant, looping handwriting filled the lines. At the top, it was dated 1947. It was a list of names, account numbers, and amounts. But this was no ordinary ledger. The heading read, Contingency Accounts, St. Jude's Benevolent Fund. I had never heard of it. The names, however, were familiar. They were the founding members of my electrician's union local. Page after page documented a secret fund, a rainy day account set up by the union founders after the war, hidden from the official books to protect it from mismanagement or raids. My father was its custodian. The final entry from 1987, just before he died, noted a final balance transfer to a numbered trust at a small local credit union. The trust was set to dissolve, with funds dispersed to the state in 10 days. This wasn't just a union fund. The last page contained a notarized codicil to my father's will. It stated that if his identity was ever used for fraudulent purposes after his death, a specific portion of this trust, $50,000, was to be released immediately to any legal authority investigating the crime, designated as an investigative grant. He had created a bounty on his own identity. He knew. My father, with his paranoid foresight, had anticipated a world where even a man's name could be stolen from the grave. This wasn't just a failsafe. It was a trap, baited and set 50 years ago, waiting for a predator like Rick to step in it. The screwdriver wasn't just a tool for fixing wires. It was a key. I now had motive, means, and a mountain of evidence. The next step was clear. The next morning, I did not call my pro bono lawyer. I called the State Attorney General's office, the Elder Abuse and Financial Fraud Division. I didn't tell them the whole story. I simply said I had primary evidence, a death certificate, and social security number, proving that a state-licensed FHA counselor was operating under the stolen identity of a deceased person, and that there was a financial incentive for a swift investigation. The woman on the phone, an investigator named Miller, was silent for a long moment. Then, her voice was all business. "Mr. Davis, I need you to stay calm and do nothing. Do not confront the suspect. We will be in touch within the hour." The weight of the last 3 months began to lift, replaced by a cold, sharp sense of purpose. The gears of a machine much larger than Rick had ever imagined were beginning to turn. Investigator Miller called back 45 minutes later. We've cross-referenced the state licensing board with the Social Security master death file. Arthur Davis is indeed your deceased father. This isn't just fraud, Mr. Davis. This is a felony involving multiple state and federal agencies. We're petitioning for an emergency court order to freeze the mortgage account and any associated bank accounts. For the next few days, I played the part of the defeated old man perfectly. I sighed, shuffled my feet, and let Rick think he was in complete control. He was practically vibrating with excitement, talking about the warm weather in Belize and making condescending remarks about how I needed to accept the new reality. He was so busy celebrating his victory, he never saw the ambush. On the 9th day, the day before his flight, Rick brought in his advisor for one last piece of paperwork. "Just a formality," he explained, his smile wide and predatory. "This releases the final disbursement and transfers full title to the holding company." He thought he was taking the house. In reality, he was walking into a cage. Miller had prepped to me. Let them come to you. Let them sit down. The moment they present a document for you to sign, we'll have them for attempted theft. In addition to the fraud, my team will be outside. As Rick and the advisor sat at my kitchen table, the air grew thick with anticipation. The sharp wind rattled the windows, the same sound I'd heard on that first terrible day. This was the final insult. With the entire machinery of the state's Justice Department waiting just beyond my front door, Rick had the audacity to push one last piece of paper in front of me, one last demand for a signature. He was so arrogant, so certain of my weakness, that he couldn't conceive of a world where I wasn't his victim. He couldn't see the trap was already sprung. He slid the pen across the polished oak. "Sign it, old man," he said, his voice dropping the false kindness for good. "Let's finish this." I looked from his smug face to the pen, then back again. I picked it up, feeling its smooth plastic shell. I let the silence hang in the room, savoring the last few seconds of his blissful ignorance. And that brought us back to the glare of the overhead light, the final signature page sitting between us. Rick and his accomplice watched me, their faces a mixture of impatience and triumph. Rick tapped his finger on the table. "Come on, William. We don't have all day." The faint scent of lemon polish, Betty's scent, seemed to fill the air, a silent source of strength. I set the pen down gently, next to the document, but not on it. "Tell me something, Rick," I said, my voice steady and clear. "When you were building this little scheme, did you ever wonder about my father, Thomas Davis? Or was he just a name you pulled from a dusty old paper in a dead woman's gardening box?" Rick's face went slack with shock. The blood drained from his face, leaving a pasty, gray pallor. His accomplice, Davis, looked between us, his smug expression melting into confusion and alarm. "What are you talking about?" Rick stammered, his composure shattering like cheap glass. "You're not making any sense." But his eyes darted toward the front door, the animal instinct to flee kicking in. "My father was a meticulous man," I continued, my voice calm, almost conversational. "He believed in redundancies, fail-safes. He even built one into his own identity, just in case a ghoul like you ever tried to dig him up for spare parts." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, dark-handled screwdriver. I placed it on a table between us. This was his. Rick stared at the screwdriver as if it were a venomous snake, the worthless old junk he'd told me to throw away. He couldn't understand. "It's a screwdriver," he said, his voice a panicked hiss. "What is wrong with you?" He began to push his chair back, ready to run. "This is a waste of time. Sign the paper, or we'll have you declared incompetent." At that exact moment, the front door burst open. It didn't swing. It slammed against the interior wall with a deafening crack. Two uniformed officers and Investigator Miller filled the doorway, their faces grim and unyielding. Miller held up her badge. "Rick Peterson, you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent." The accomplice, the fake advisor, froze in his chair, his hands shooting into the air as if by reflex. But Rick, fueled by pure cornered animal rage, lunged across the table, not at the officers, but at me. "You old bastard," he screamed, his hands reaching for my throat. Before he could touch me, he was yanked backward, his arms wrenched behind him with brutal efficiency. As they cuffed him, his eyes, wild with disbelief and hatred, were locked on mine. "How?" he choked out, the word barely audible over the crackle of the police radio. "How did you know?" I simply pointed a steady finger at the screwdriver still resting on the table. "You should never have dismissed my father's tools," I said. "He was a much smarter man than either of us." Miller stepped forward, picking up the stack of papers Rick had tried to force on me. "I'll be taking these as evidence," she said. She glanced at the account numbers and the disbursement schedule. "We already have the court order for the account freeze," she confirmed. "Not a single cent more will be moved. The $65,000 he already took, we'll get that back too. It's all traceable." The entire legal mechanism of the reverse mortgage, a fortress of paper that had seemed so impenetrable, had been built on one single fraudulent point: the FHA counseling certificate. By proving the counselor, Arthur Davis was a stolen identity, the entire structure had collapsed. The contract was void from its inception. The loan had never legally existed. They hauled Rick out, still sputtering threats and curses. The accomplice was let out in silence, his face ashen. The kitchen, which had been a stage for my humiliation and near destruction, was suddenly quiet again. The only sound was the sharp wind outside, rattling the windows as if trying to get in and sweep away the last vestiges of the nightmare. Investigator Miller turned to me, her expression softening. The St. Jude's Trust was a brilliant piece of work. The promise of an investigative fund got this case fast-tracked past a dozen others. Your father was one of a kind, Mr. Davis. She explained that Rick's scheme was bigger than just me. He was part of the ring that had been targeting seniors across 3 states. My testimony, combined with the evidence from the fraudulent license, was the linchpin that would bring down the entire conspiracy. The flight to Belize wasn't just an escape. It was a rendezvous with his partners. He had talked. He gave up everyone to try and save himself, but it was too late. My father's foresight had unraveled them all. After the officers left, I stood alone in my kitchen. The table was scarred where Rick had slammed his fists. The air still felt charged, electric. I picked up the small screwdriver, its rosewood handle, feeling warm in my hand. It was more than a tool, more than a key, it was a legacy. A promise from a father to a son that he would never be truly alone. I walked through the house, my house, touching the familiar surfaces. The worn armchair, the smooth kitchen counter, the polished wood of the mantelpiece where Betty's picture sat. Her quiet smile seemed to approve. She had been my compass in life, and my memory of her, her insistence on keeping every useless old thing, had helped guide me through this. The legal battle was long, but it was a formality. With the primary contract voided, the liens on my house were dissolved within weeks. The state seized all of Rick's assets and the process of restitution began. It was a slow, grinding process, but the outcome was never in doubt. The foundation of his crime was sand, and I had kicked it over. Months later, I sat at my kitchen table once more. The scars on the wood were still there, a faint reminder. In front of me was a letter from the Attorney General's office. It was a final notification. All stolen funds had been recovered and returned to a new, secure account in my name. The case was officially closed. There was a second document enclosed, a check for $50,000. It was the investigative grant from my father's trust. A note from Miller was attached. The state has declined the use of these funds. It read, "The trust's bylaws stipulate that in such a case, the money reverts to the legal heir." That's you, William. Your father left you one last gift. I looked at the check, my father's name printed indirectly upon it through the trust he had built. He had reached across 30 years of silence to protect me. It wasn't about the money. It was about the final, undeniable truth. They had underestimated the wrong old man. They had underestimated the wrong family. I placed the check on the counter, then walked over to the window and looked out at the backyard where Betty and I had burned the first mortgage papers so long ago. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. I took a deep breath of the cool, clean air. Then I turned around and walked to the phone to make a call to a contractor about fixing the front door.